G'day you mob, how's it going? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. I'm your host Pete, and today we have an interview episode with Sean Dooley. Now, Sean Dooley is the National Public Affairs Manager of Birdlife Australia. He used to be the editor of the Birdlife magazine until last year, and he's also the author of a number of books, including this one, The Big Twitch. So today we talk about Birdlife Australia and its role in Australia and conservation, research, education for bird life in Australia. Birds. We talk about the Aussie Backyard Bird Count, which is taking place this year on the 19th to the 25th of October, and you can get involved. All you need to do is download the free app and spend 20 minutes, as many times as you want during that week, or really the month of October, checking out the birds outside and just noting which ones you saw. And it helps birds and bird conservation and Birdlife Australia. Okay, so anyway, this interview is a really interesting one. We talk about a whole bunch of different topics, including his life, how he got into becoming a twitcher, how he was writing comedy for a while for some pretty impressive Australian TV shows, and how he ended up working for Birdlife Australia, as well as the state of birds in Australia. And we also talk about the bin chicken and the kookaburra quite a bit. Anyway, without any further ado, guys, smack the bird. You can probably tell that I like birds as well. And let's get into it. I always hate that when I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I've got this, and then you introduce them and you just screw it up.
I know, it's my constant fear. I tend not to say names for the fear of getting it, misremembering it, or just getting it wrong.
Well, we can start the podcast there, man. So it's like, g'day guys, welcome to this episode of Aussie English. I have some bloke from Birdlife Australia. Welcome, some bloke.
Excellent. Well, at least you corrected yourself. People still call it Birds Australia, which was what we were called before the merger in 2012. So,
but I will introduce you properly though. So we have Sean Dooley here from Birdlife Australia. How are you going, mate? How's your day been?
Yes, I'm well. Day's been one of those blurry ones of working from home and jumping onto various meetings and jumping out and doing various bits of work without any one major thing being achieved, and thinking, hang on, what day is it? Tuesday or Sunday, or is it? Can't remember.
That sounds like my average day. Hey, you're in Melbourne, right?
Yes, yeah. So luckily I'm in Bayside, Melbourne, so within my 5 kilometres of allowable exercise radius, I can get down the beach and see a few birds, and we're in a fairly leafy suburb, so that's keeping me a little bit sane, that sampling of nature outside my door. But for a bird watcher and a former twitcher who would chase around the country racing after rare birds, it's beginning to wear a bit thin, not being able to get outside and go where you want to look for birds.
Well, I'm pretty irritated with it all. I got into bird photography. So my father's name is Ian Smithson, and he does all the sort of Bellarine Peninsula bird photography stuff, and he's been doing it ever since I was a little lad. But I never got into it until probably 2 or 3 years ago in Canberra, where my wife wanted to get into photography, and I'm like, well, screw buildings. Like, I want to photograph. I have a background in biology. I did my bachelor's, master's and PhD in evolutionary biology at Melbourne Uni and the Museum Victoria. And I've always loved animals. So I was like, if we're going to do photography, there's no chance we're just doing buildings with a wide angle lens. We're going to get some big ass lens that we can get close to some of these small birds. And then I fell in love with it. And so yeah, I told my dad, I'm like, I'm interviewing someone from Birdlife Australia, named Sean Dooley. Have you heard of him? And he's like, yeah, just let me come over and give you this book, check it out, have a read. And, I've been doing my little bit of research, but it's really funny where Dad's like, yeah, I've known about him for ages. And I was like, oh, well, just been out of the loop. But man, this interview was going to be about Birdlife Australia. Well, it still is. And, the bird count this year. But before we get into that, after doing my sort of little bit of digging into my interviewee, I found out how interesting a subject you are. So could you tell us your story with becoming a twitcher, and also obviously defining what a twitcher is?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I grew up in a place called Seaford, which is in Bayside, Melbourne. I guess I don't live too far from where I grew up now. Life's come full circle. But back then in the late 70s, early 80s, Seaford had a pretty rough reputation. Not that we were that aware of it, really. It was just home, and it was a great place to grow up. It had the beach nearby, kind of Melbourne's best beach, because there's no development for 5 kilometres along it. Had a creek filled with bushland. The creek was a bit polluted, but so I've always loved nature. But as a kid, I'd collect the Weet-Bix packet that they had little cards of wildlife, but it was all African wildlife and things like lions and giraffes. And I pretty soon worked out, after getting told off for digging up the driveway looking for fossils, that there weren't dinosaurs in Seaford or hippos or zebras or anything like that. And then, so I put my love of nature a bit on hold until my grade 5 teacher at primary school, at Seaford North Primary School, he was a bird watcher and he was a bird bander. He used to go and set up nets, mist nets and little trap nets to catch the robins that came to next to the school. And then he would catch them, put metal bands on them and then release them, and then hope that he could catch them again the next season, or somebody else would catch them, so we get a sense of where birds move. And he had like a pair of binoculars for every kid in the class, and he used to take the class down to the edge of the swamp, which our school bordered Seaford wetlands, and back then it was called the Swamp. And basically I headed into grade 5 petrified of this teacher, that he would give me the strap, because he had this fearsome reputation among the naughty kids in the school, like my brother, that he, of all the male teachers there that doled out corporal punishment, he was the worst.
You should probably explain that for the listeners that may not have grown up in Australia, especially not in the 70s and 80s. What was the strap, and why was that sort of the bane or fear of most primary school boys?
Yes, there was. I'm not sure when corporal punishment was abolished in Victorian schools, so I presume it was sometime in the 1980s. And I went to primary school in most of the 70s. Mostly in the 70s, and at our school it was still permissible. So for a child, usually a boy, I don't remember a girl ever being strapped. The headmaster, the principal had, like, rather than a cane, apparently it was a strap. I never saw it, so fairly regularly assured me it was an actual strap. Whether that was a belt or something, I don't know, but it apparently lived in the headmaster's office, and this grade 5 teacher would march down there and pull it out, and it was in a case. I remember the case.
Jesus.
And so the naughty kids got whacked with this strap, this mysterious strap. And
was that across the hands or on the bum, or?
I think it was across the hands.
Yeah, full on.
And you had to be. It didn't come out very often. It wasn't like
you had to stab someone or something to get.
Yeah.
Right?
It wasn't like an English boarding school, but
where you just show up and they just give it to you in the morning, assuming you're going to do something wrong.
Exactly. 6 of the best. It's, So I really had nothing to fear, but I was a bit paranoid, and I knew that this teacher liked birds, and I thought going into grade 5, if I liked birds, then he might go easy on me. I mean, ultimately it backfired, because I ended up completely falling in love with birds, and spent a lot more time with this teacher than I ever.
That's not the best way to stay off his radar, right? It's
exactly,
to take up the same hobby that he has.
Yeah. And so, I fished out an old bird book that some great aunt had given me when I was very young. It was called the Gould League Urban Birds book, that had maybe illustrations of 40 or 50 birds you could get in urban areas. And I remember stalking in the road across the park these birds and trying to work out what they were. And by the time I started school, I was absolutely hooked. By the time I started grade 5, I was totally obsessed with, thought they were amazing creatures. Here was this nature experience that I'd yearned for, And I didn't have to go to the Serengeti plains in Africa. I could get it in my backyard, literally. And fortunately, my school had a backyard, which was this wetland, and it had a massive array of different species of water birds and bush birds around the edge, and all sorts of different birds would come and go. And, it's close to probably about almost 200 species have been seen there. And I've seen
200.
Yeah, like about 170, 180 over the years.
And for quick context, how many species are there in Australia? Like 700, 800?
Yeah, each year there would be roughly about 700 to 750 recorded every year in Australia.
And you had like a quarter of that, maybe a bit less.
Yes,
at the swamp.
yeah.
That's incredible.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's a great area. And one of the unintended consequences of my getting into a bird watching obsession was I would go down the swamp regularly, and I bumped into other bird watchers there, usually much older men. Like, I was a 12-year-old boy, and there were like 50-year-old men there, and my parents were thrilled that I was meeting in places like swamps.
Yeah, just stay out in the open, mate.
Yes, but between me and particularly one other bird watcher who I met there, us going and doing what we loved, which was looking at birds and recording them, but also entering those records into a database, which has now become Birdlife Australia's bird data database. Those records went into the system, and when land managers and governments were looking at what should happen to this swamp, because there were big development threats in the 70s and 80s for it, it was those records of that strange little kid that I was and that strange middle-aged man that showed that this swamp was actually a wetland of international significance, and it's the only wetland in Australia that totally urban wetland that has attained that status. So it's officially recognised in an international treaty as part of the Ramsar Treaty of International Wetlands. And it's the only urban area in Australia that's recognised as a wetland of international significance. And that means that area are protected for those wetland values. And those values were built upon the birds that we saw. We saw that swamp and the nearby swamp, between them, they often get more than 1% of the world's population of migratory shorebirds like the sharp-tailed sandpiper, and they're important winter refuges for the endangered Australasian bittern. And that probably wouldn't have achieved that status if we hadn't have been going out and birding and recording what we saw. So it's very much an unintended consequence of a purely selfish obsession. But
what makes that specific area in urban Melbourne so unique, when you would imagine in parts of northern Australia there would be huge wetland? I guess they're seasonal, but
yes.
Is there something unique about that swamp, or it's just a sort of aberration?
It's the remnants, the last remaining natural remnants of a much larger swamp, the vast Karam swamp, which, for people who know the Melbourne area, stretched from the suburbs of Mordialloc across to Dandenong and then down to Frankston.
I've got a map on my wall, so I'm just sort of checking that out.
Yeah. So it was something like can't remember exactly, like a 10,000 hectare swamp.
Jesus.
And now the two remnants are Edithvale and Seaford wetlands, and I think they're around 100 hectares each. So it's the last fraction of this once mighty swamp. But it still attracts a lot of birds, particularly during droughts. Some of the wetlands are kept artificially high in droughts through stormwater runoff, or through, at Seaford now we're managing to the Melbourne Water manage the land, and they're managing to pump in some water off a wastewater drain, like just a stormwater drain, that keeps the swamp topped up. And so these coastal wetlands, especially in southern Australia around Melbourne, are actually really important drought refuges for the birds of the Murray-Darling Basin and even the Lake Eyre Basin. All those water birds that go up there and breed, when they dry out in drought, they hit the coast. And these wetlands at Seaford are one of the spots that they love to come to.
I was watching something recently, I think it was on Lake Eyre, having one of the biggest floods in the last decade or so. And all of a sudden, it seems like the flood occurs, all the water comes down. Is it the Murray-Darling Basin, or it's further in from Queensland, where the water all goes inland to this salt lake? But the weird thing for me was that the pelicans arrive almost instantly, like thousands of them. How on earth does that happen? Like, my dad and I were trying to look into it and find out, like, how do they know with the water, especially when it's a decade thing? It's not an annual migration. Hey, let's go inland. It's it's rained a little extra this year, Bill. Let's head inland because there's going to be shitloads of water there.
It's an incredible phenomenon, and we don't really know. But what is amazing is the Lake Eyre and other of those sort of lakes in that basin. They can fill up months after the rain has fallen. So that makes it more incredible. So the rain will generally, when Lake Eyre floods, the rain falls in the Gulf country of Queensland. And then what doesn't run into the Gulf of Carpentaria flows southward along several rivers that are usually dry, sort of 7 out of 10 years, completely dry. But those rivers form the Channel country, and this huge, enormous expanse of water moves slowly down through the Channel country. And if there's enough water in a big wet year, then it will fill up Lake Eyre to a degree, maybe not completely full, but large. There'll be a deep enough water level that it will create this bloom of life and shield shrimps and things, and you get the water birds turning up. And we don't know how they do it. We think it could be some birds may hear infrasound, that incredibly low subsonic sound. So they may hear thunderstorms thousands of kilometres away, and that will trigger a sort of,
instinctual response or something.
Muscle memory that in a couple of months will head up there. They might be able to detect sort of barometric pressure systems, things like that. But it might be that they are just constantly sending scouts out to check conditions. I mean, a pelican, lots of birds do it, but pelicans are the great example. They're the most obvious example. They will just completely disappear from around the areas of the coast and turn up in their tens of thousands to breed on lakes like Lake Eyre. And it may be that a pelican, they can soar very high on thermals. They might constantly be sending scouts sailing up, and they can see hundreds of kilometres from up there. And then be flying and then coming back and reporting back. So either way, it is incredible. It just goes to show there's so much about birds we underestimate their intelligence and their ability to adapt and survive in these, in the harsh conditions of extreme conditions of Australia.
Well, that stuff in Lake Eyre, I think, with the shield shrimp and the fish and the frogs, you kind of like, these things all inherently rely on water, but they only have it once every 10 years or something, and it's usually for only a few months, right? And so the weird thing is that they're kind of like in eggs or beneath the sand buried, and they just stay in this sort of torpor, dormant state, right, for years at a time, using very little energy. And then when it rains, they're like, we're ready, quick, grow, mate, and then we'll go back down into the sand. I'll see you in 7 years.
Yes. You can just conceptually get your head around it for birds because they can fly off.
Yeah.
The fact that you have these burrowing frogs, that you have shield shrimp, that you have fish that can grow to quite large size.
Like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, manage to survive in the few remnant water holes or just the moist substrate of a riverbed. So to the surface it looks dry, but all these things are surviving, whether it's in egg form or as you say, torpor. It's just an incredible thing.
Mate, so last night I was telling my dad, and I'm like, what should I ask him? I was like, Dad, you should probably come and do this interview, to be honest. And he's like, no, I'm not coming and crashing it. And I got him coming over. I think it was 11:30 p.m. And he's like, you got to read The Big Twitch. You got to read it. And then ask him some questions. I'm like, I don't know if I've got enough time to read the entire book before tomorrow's interview. But so I did want to ask you, though, you wrote this book, I think, back in 2005 about a trip that you did in 2001. Can you tell us the inspiration for the trip that you did in 2001 and also, why you wrote the book?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was 2002 actually, and what had happened, I grew up in Seaford, which was fairly, I guess working class really, but I had I'd won a scholarship to a private school and gone to a different school away from Seaford. My parents still lived in the area, but I'd ended up going to Melbourne Uni to study law as the traditional way to get into the comedy industry in Australia. And that actually was my genuine motivation.
Really?
Yeah, I'd gone to uni with Mick Malloy, the comedian. He was ahead of me a couple of years, and he'd gone on to Melbourne Uni, and he said to me and another mate, a guy called Matthew Tilley, who went on to be Melbourne's number one breakfast radio DJ comedian sort of thing in the 2000s. And he said to us both, come up, see this show I'm on at Melbourne Uni. I think you'd like it. And it was the Melbourne Uni Law Review. And I, for the first time in my life, thought, that's what I want to do. I wasn't planning. I had been planning on doing a combined law and zoology degree at Monash Uni because I wasn't really a great scientist, but at Monash you could do an arts degree and study zoology at that stage.
Yep.
I changed my plans. I wanted to go to Melbourne Uni and I got the marks for the law. So I went in there so I could get into the law review and do comedy, which took a while. But so I ended up having a career in television. The bird thing was just completely my hobby, just the thing I loved doing when I had the chance to get out there and go bird watching. And life went on and I was working in television comedy. But then so when I was still in my final years of uni, my mum got sick with terminal cancer, and then my dad, after she died, he got sick not long after. And so I'd spent much of my 20s shuffling backwards and forwards from sort of uni work back to home, looking after mum and dad in various degrees. And then after mum died and dad got diagnosed, I moved back to be. And then after he died, I was a bit lost. At the time, I didn't really have any work, television. All the TV shows I'd worked on had been cancelled because, well, hopefully not because of my involvement, but because of because the reality TV thing hit, so they weren't, they were cancelling all those sorts of shows. So I found myself at this juncture in my life where, I was a bit unsure in which direction to go and what to do. So I decided that after, I guess, caring for others and for those years, that I'd just do something completely reckless and selfish. So I decided to follow, I guess, a childhood dream of seeing more birds in 1 year than anybody else had ever seen in Australia. And so I set about, when my inheritance came through, it wasn't a lot. I could have put a deposit on a house in Melbourne back then, but and that was just before the property boom, so I was a bit of an idiot not to, but instead four-wheel drive and travelled around Australia seeing as many birds as I could in 1 year and breaking the record along the way. And that became, I called it the Big Twitch at the time, and I ended up writing a book about it.
So how many birds did you get out of, the odd 750, 800 birds that can be seen in Australia?
Yeah, at the time, using the taxonomy list that they had, it's changed since, and if I went back and redid the list of what I saw, it would actually be more.
Yeah.
At the time, the record had been 633 species, and I managed to see 703 for the year. So
insane.
The record that held good for about 10 years until someone with more money to burn, even more insane than I, went and beat me using a different list, but they basically beat me quite convincingly.
How do they prove it? Do you need to take a photo of every bird that you see to show, to have evidence?
Yeah, that's a lot of people ask that. I say I didn't. I realised at first my plan had been originally to do it as a fundraiser, to get people to almost like sponsor me per bird, how many birds I'd see. But I realised I couldn't do that because I couldn't prove that I had seen them. And bird watching, you know, a lot of it does rely on the honesty of the participants. You know, I'm not saying all bird watchers are honest, but reputation is very important. And
there's a few incentives in there, right, to see things that you may not necessarily have seen, or to mistakenly assume saw what you didn't see.
Oh, definitely. And there are several quite, you know, infamous incidents of people fabricating sightings, not just pretending that they'd seen something, but even faking where they took a photograph of a bird, or even faking photographs with digitally altering images and things like that. So
this shit's full on. This
yes,
isn't, you know, it's not for beginners.
Yes, but I did have a video camera with me and probably filmed about 150 different species, some of the rarer ones at times, and often I was by myself. I couldn't, but I did meet up with other bird watchers at other times. So there are some witnesses who could verify I saw particularly the rare birds.
Yeah.
But generally it just came down to a matter of trust and reputation. And I like to think I had a reputation as being honest. And for me, it was a personal quest. It was about putting my knowledge of Australia's birds and it was like a big investigation. It was like a jigsaw puzzle. You know, I was trying to see 700 birds, and each piece in that puzzle had different requirements of the time of year, the habitat, the location, those sorts of things. The birds that blew in on cyclones or accidentally followed a ship across from America and turned up. So it was this puzzle to put together. It was testing my knowledge. It was really personal. It was that thing where I was really lost after the death of my parents and unsure of my place in the world. And it was a personal odyssey for me. And so I set the bar high in that I was very much, I didn't count anything. I didn't count any birds unless I saw them 100%.
Yeah.
I got the true essence of that bird, because what was the point really? And there was probably, in the end, only 3 or 4 that I did see that didn't count, like little things like a bird called a Carpentarian grass wren up near Mount Isa that I spent 3 days in the searing heat searching for, and the best I saw was the arse end of it running into a spinifex clump and not coming out for the next 5 hours. And I knew that's as that tail disappeared, and I just saw the tail, I knew that it couldn't be anything other than a Carpentarian grass wren, but I couldn't definitively say that it wasn't something else.
Yeah.
And so even though I didn't see it and I knew that's what it was, I didn't actually claim it because I hadn't experienced the bird. For me, it was about that experiencing that whole sense of the bird.
So was it worth it? I think you likened the trip to pissing your inheritance up against a wall. Was it worth it in the end?
Well, it was. It was certainly the most incredible year of my life. And it made me, on a personal level, it was very healing. You know, I wouldn't say I was broken, but I was certainly lost, I think. And I don't think I necessarily had any grand epiphany, but it certainly was a way to heal. And, you know, I highly recommend if you're grieving to spend a year by yourself in the outback. It gives you a sense of perspective, I guess. But more than that, it did, apart from being an amazing year that I loved doing and could have kept on going, if I hadn't have had during the year I worked for 2 weeks on a pilot for a Channel 9 comedy show, and it got up. And so I had to come back and start working on that in January of the next year. So if I didn't have that, I could well have just kept driving. And
you'd still be there.
And I'd still be there. But it did change the course of my life, because although I did come back to probably about 2.5 years of solid work in the television industry, something had shifted, and I developed the book concept after that and wrote the book, and when the book was published, I became, I guess, a voice for the birds in a sense. I was telling the book, the big twitch is a lot of people just wanted me to write a bird guide saying, You go here, you'll see this bird. And excuse me. And rather than write a simple where to go bird watching guide, I actually wanted to tell a story. I'd always wanted to be a writer and wanted to tell a narrative. My story, but also the story of the people I met, the story of the country I travelled through, and the story of the birds. And it struck such a chord with people. It sold, I think, much to the publisher's surprise, it sold really well. And at the time, knowing who, like, for instance, the membership of Birdlife Australia, it sold more copies than there were registered bird watchers in the country. So it was obviously tapping into something other than just the pure bird nerds. And so that set me on a different path, and I began to I began to be offered writing magazine pieces or newspaper pieces about birds or conservation and a few other things. But it pretty clearly, through the book, it became very clear that there was this innate interest in birds in Australia, and someone needed to tell those stories. So that's what I started doing.
You've got a really interesting section here at the start where you've called it the glossary or the glossary. Obviously a piss take on cassowary and glossary, yes, where you list a bunch of different slang terms. Before we get into a few of these, which I wanted to ask you about, because I'm sure my listeners will love it, can you tell us the difference between a bird watcher, a twitcher, and a bird photographer?
Yeah, probably. I one way you could delineate those terms is that bird watchers are probably far happier than the other. Far happier people.
Because they're just relaxing, are they? They're not like, yeah, it doesn't matter if we get it or not, or we see it or not. We're just enjoying ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah. A bird watcher is a generic term for people who like to look at birds or just like seeing or hearing birds. Excuse me, got a bit of a...
Hopefully it's not COVID.
Yeah, hopefully not. I've had this cough since March, actually, so...
Uh-oh.
Tested, so... so bird watchers are the people who just like having birds in their lives, and you can be as... get into it as much as you like or not. It can be the backyard birder, people who just like watching birds come into their backyard, or they might have a bird bath or watch them come in and not even know the names. So it's a very broad term. A twitcher is kind of at the extreme end of the bird watching spectrum.
This is kind of the person who plays Pokemon Go and has caught everything.
Yes. Basically, I'd say that twitchers are like addicts in that they're looking for the next fix, and the next fix is a new bird to add to your list.
And it's never as good as the first one, right?
Yeah, in some ways, and it certainly, it's always the next fix. And when you start bird watching, you can satisfy that really easily, because every bird you go out in the park locally, every bird's new. And that's a beautiful, glorious time when you're seeing so many new things. And there is even the most ardent anti-twitcher, the purists who sneer at twitching as being, gauche. Everybody loves the thrill of seeing something for the first time. So yes, everybody really enjoys seeing something for the first time, but the twitcher just needs that fix of seeing something new all the time. So they have to go further and further afield. And then if you're somebody like me, I guess, who's travelled all around Australia, you can't even get those fixes because there's no new areas to go and see the different birds. So you start relying on your fix for birds that turn up where they're not meant to be. They're often called accidental birds or vagrants. And yep. So basically you will hear about not that I'm talking from experience here at all, but you will hear about a Japanese gull turning up in Townsville in North Queensland. So you jump on the first plane from Melbourne to North Queensland and blow, maybe it was $800 looking for...
I think you said it was an 8-hour round trip on the same day.
Yes, only to arrive and find that the bird had flown off the day before and you hadn't listened to the instructions properly.
Yeah, I can't believe that, because I was reading your book and you were saying as well, I think you went to Broome in order to see a starling, was it? But that one you managed to nail and you got to actually see. And that must be like to put it crassly, that's fucking mind-blowing. You're in Melbourne, you hear of a single small individual starling bird on the other side of the continent, and you can take a plane, fly out, and you get to see that individual bird. Like, you've found straight away the needle in the haystack, right? That is sometimes in the haystack.
Yes, and often not straight away. It's fraught with lots of tension and apprehension. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's great fun. It's something I realised a few years ago. I've stopped doing because I now have. Unlike then, I have a steady job and a family and
responsibilities.
Neither of those actually, are conducive to being able to drop everything and jump.
Well, I was thinking, it's funny because I was talking to Dad, and Dad's always like, bird photography is probably one of the most expensive hobbies you could ever imagine, except for maybe buying cars. But it sounds like being a full-on Twitcher would actually be, the more expensive one, because every single one of those trips would be like buying a new lens.
Yeah, definitely. Photography, the reason I've never really got into it, I actually we had just got a new camera at Birdlife for staff use, and I grabbed it the day that we had to go to working from home. So I've been trying to teach myself how to use it. But I've never got into it because when I started, it wasn't digital photography. It was expensive because you would need this expensive slide film.
Yeah.
And you never knew how, like, I'd be on trips with bird watchers, twitchers, and they would shoot a roll of, 24 shots to the roll.
Kodak, yeah.
Be lucky if they got 2 that were any good.
Well, that's the best thing now. I mean, I've gotten into it at the end of the trail, right? My dad came through with all of that sort of stuff, and then the digital era kind of made a completely different world of it. And now I have no appreciation because I just go out and I'll take 2,000 shots in an afternoon, and you just come home and sift through and you get 5, that are like nailed it. And you can take 10 shots in a second when the animal's about to do what you want it to do. And one of those may have nailed that moment. But I can't imagine back in the day with film, because you would have spent half the time reloading as well, even if you were able to take that many. Anyway, it was really funny. Before we get into the slang, I was thinking last night, I'm like, I've got this guy. I've got a story, I've seen a bird he hasn't seen. And so I was like, I remember earlier this year, I think my dad's like, it may have been last year. He's like, Pete, get your gear. We're going to Werribee Sewerage Plant. There's a tufted duck there. And I was like, what the hell is a tufted duck? And so I'm trying to find the species name. I look it up, and lo and behold, you're the one being interviewed about the tufted duck coming to Werribee. And I was like, son of a bitch. So he's seen this one as well. So how does something like that happen? For those of you who don't know, which is probably the majority, a tufted duck is apparently a Japanese duck that had never been seen in Australia and was found in the Werribee sewage plants at the bottom, the arse end of Australia by itself. How does that happen?
Yeah, well, this is one of the joys of bird watching, is that birds have wings and can literally turn up anywhere. And what you have is you have a lot of migratory species, including migrants that cross the hemispheres. And it's one of the remarkable factors that make birds such fascinating creatures. We have these birds, shorebirds, like one shorebird there, a redneck stint, weighs about 30 grams. Like, it's a bit of about the weight of a chocolate bar or something.
And these are the ones that come from Siberia.
Yeah, and they breed in Siberia. And they stop and refuel along the way. But we certainly know from some of the banding that was done, I think it was birds that were banded in Broome were found in Victoria or Tasmania 3 days later.
What?
So these little birds, sparrow-sized birds, essentially, with longer bills and longer legs, mate. And there's about 35 species of these migratory shorebirds in Australia every year. They make these incredible journeys, but occasionally something goes wrong with individual birds, and it could be weather conditions. They could get blown off course. It could be some sort of virus or just something goes wrong with their internal GPS.
It's just turning them to the left. Yeah.
Yeah, they should have taken a left at Albuquerque. And So a bird like the tufted duck may have come from Japan, from China, somewhere. They're quite common across all of Eurasia, really common bird in England. This bird, they do migrate a bit, but they've never, I think there've been one Southern Hemisphere record before that, like in Java or something.
Yeah.
And this one migrating presumably from North Asia down to Southern China, it just kept going. And it kept going right across Indonesia, all of Australia, and somehow ended up at Werribee Sewage Farm, the Western Treatment Plant. And I think it was a visiting birder, someone from North America, who saw it and went, "Hey, a tufted duck," and then said, "Hang on, it's not in my Australian field guide," and bumped into another birding group and said, "Oh, I've seen this bird. Is that unusual here?" And they were just losing their minds.
They were like, "Yeah, you're full of shit, mate. That didn't happen." And then they saw it, right? And we're like, "Holy crap!"
Yeah. And so then they went, and the word got around. And I still would have gone for it, living on the other side of the bay. But at the time, I was on holiday on the Great Ocean Road and was just sitting at the surf club at the end of towards the end of the afternoon. And my kids had gone back with our friends who were staying with them. Me and my wife had a moment alone. We were just having a quiet, cold one on the balcony of the surf club when I noticed a text from a bird-watching friend in Brisbane. "Oh, have you seen the tufted duck?" And he'd seen it on Facebook or internet or something. I'd been on the beach all day, and so this friend in Brisbane was telling me about this bird. And I'd been in Darwin or something, and I was like, no, where is it? And he said, "Oh, it's at Werribee." And I thought, "Oh, that's only an hour away." So I quickly, grabbed the binoculars and headed off and managed to see it. And it became quite a celebrity. It was one of the biggest twitches in Australian birding history. I think over 500 people went out to see it. So,
well, we went down there. I can't remember which day it would have been, but there were probably 50 people. Like all these cars are almost standing up. I got a photo of it. I was so proud,
yes.
And I'm like, I still have no real appreciation for it. I just photographed Dad, but I'm glad that you seem to be really excited.
Oh, I got a photo of the crowd. I didn't take one of the duck. I took it of the crowd because. Yeah, I think when I was there, it was that first afternoon and people had already come and gone, but I think it was 35 cars and I counted over 50 people there, and that was just in a 1 hour window. So
it was very bizarre because there's like all these thin sort of roads between dams that are sewage treatment. The water sits there, and there was just people driving all over the place when we got there trying to find it. And then, all of a sudden there would be a big group and everyone would be like, "Oh, it's over there, it's over there." And then it would just take off and go to another dam and you'd be like, "Oh, we're going to try and find it again." But moving on to the slang. So can you define a few of these for me? A birder or birdo?
Oh, yes. I should actually look what I said in the big twitch.
I can get it for you in front of me.
Yeah,
if you want.
A birder is what sort of more serious bird watchers like to call themselves, because bird watcher has a bit of a frivolous or not very hard sort of reputation. Like birdwatcher could be anything from little old lady who feeds the pigeons. So people who get serious about it like to call themselves, at least in Australia and England, birders.
Yeah. The Aussie's birdo.
Yeah, Aussie. It used to be birdo, but that's become a little bit naff and passé, I think. A bit cute, but it is that Australian thing of always wanting to put an O or an E on the end of it. So you couldn't do birdie. So you did birdo, but it's gone out of fashion a bit. Very few, more only the really older birders still call themselves birdos.
And what about dip or to dip out?
Oh, yeah, dip as happened for some people with the tufted duck. They were away, and by the time they got back to Melbourne and down to Werribee, the duck had flown. And so dipping out is a very unpleasant experience. It's when you go to find it, when you look for a bird that you know that has been there and you don't see it.
What about a stringer?
A stringer is basically, we were talking about stringers before. It's the worst label you can have in the birding community, and that is somebody who does. It's not about making a mistake and misidentifying a bird. That everybody does that, and that's accepted. It's the people who either don't accept that they've misidentified a bird and stay with that original identification, or they completely fabricate a sighting.
So there's even that malicious nature within people where they're just like, yeah, I'm just going to, write down that I saw this, but I didn't really.
Definitely. And it's a very hard thing to prove because it's subjective. How do we know what that person saw? But at times, the people who fabricate definitely can get caught out. People have, as I've said, people have taken photographs of birds on holidays, and then there's an infamous case a few years ago. Somebody photographed a bird when they were on holiday in Fiji, and then a year later tried to claim that they saw it, that they took the photo off Gippsland or something. So those things tend to fall apart. But the more common stringing, it's often self-delusion. It's that fine line when you don't get a good view of a bird and naturally you want to see the rarer thing rather than the common thing. And so where you go, where you start to fudge at the edges of the lexicon and
you're rounding up, not down.
You're rounding up, yeah. So you're going, well, that possibly could have been, a tufted duck, but it flew off, so I can't really tell. And so over the day, that possible becomes a probable, which may end up becoming a definite and goes down in your book. As in, well, what else could it be? And it's just automatically going for the more exotic.
A lifer.
Lifer, this is for the listers, the twitchers, the people who keep a list of all the birds they see, and a lifer is the number one desire. It is it's a new bird that you've seen in your life. So it's what's called your life list. Bird watchers will have a lot of lists: their backyard list, their suburb list, their state list, their country list.
Yeah.
List.
I think this sounds like my dad.
Yeah, the life list is the big one, really.
And to grip off. I like these phrasal verbs, right? To dip out and to grip off.
Yes, gripping off. Being gripped off is not as pleasant as it may sound.
Or as crude.
Yes, it's essentially it's when somebody who has seen a bird goes up to somebody who hasn't seen the bird, i.e. a dipper, somebody who's dipped out on seeing a bird, and basically rubs it in that they've seen it and this other person hasn't. So
have you seen these photos? I took all these photos. They're really good.
and sometimes it's malicious, and sometimes it's just bird watchers can be a bit insensitive, a bit singularly focused. So,
lost some books there, but keep going.
so they're it is that thing where they're showing the back of the camera photos. Oh, look at this beautiful plumage. Oh, look at this. You can see all the identifying features, and the poor dipper is sitting there just quietly wanting to die.
Right. All right, two more. A pill.
What's that?
A pill.
A pill.
Yeah, I think this was I think you wrote down a fat person or something in this one.
Oh, hang on.
Let me check it out. What have you got here? Pill, another name for a football. What a twitcher soon becomes if they don't get to the bird they're looking for. I wasn't sure if that was a reference to them becoming too fat because they, get frustrated and on the road all the time.
Oh, no. That's, with the glossary, I was doing it because I was going through and looking at Australianisms as well as birderisms. And, I think I talked about Australian football and how we sometimes call the football the pill, and then as a joke, I added in a pill is also an Australian slang term for somebody who's making a nuisance of themselves. But it's that like a pest, really. Oh, that bloke's a pill.
And flush.
Flush is to. Doesn't sound as rude as it's not as rude as it sounds. Flush is a questionable practice where people want to see a bird but they can't find it, and they know it's in particularly a field or a bush or something, so they will barge into the bird's to its habitat and try and get the bird to flush. It's a similar term to what they use in shooting, shooting pheasants and things like that.
Flush it out of somewhere.
Flush it out, yeah. Bird watchers don't necessarily use beaters very much to flush birds like the grouse shooters do in Britain, but and
this is where that expression comes from, to beat around the bush.
Yes, Yeah, it's there is a bit of an overlap between shooting and birding, because in the early days of ornithology, most ornithologists didn't use binoculars.
Yeah.
Good quality optics didn't exist. Field guides didn't exist. They basically used their gun to identify birds. It was like, what's that? I'll shoot it and find out. Unfortunately, we've generally moved on from there, but a lot of those terms kind of transferred through the ages. And I've always said that, you know, in some ways, bird watching still appeals to that prime instinct of hunting, of getting of conquering something. But I say it's because you don't shoot it or usually put yourself or it in life-threatening situations. It's more like hunting for wimps.
Well, it feels like that with photography, right? And it's probably why we use the verb to shoot. You know, you shoot someone, or you shoot, take some photos, right? And I'm going to go take a few shots, but it's probably from shooting like with a gun. But yeah, it is funny. I had that sort of urge. I'm like, I want to go out, see nature and, you know, see animals. Hunting or just bird or animal photography, like,
yeah. It's, you know, I've had debates with hunters and shooters before, and they, you know, they'll say, but, you know, and I actually do understand where they're coming from, that a lot of the genuine hunters, if you categorize them like that, you know, not just the yobbos, but they go out, they feel like they're, you know, they're getting into nature, into the world of their prey. They're following their prey. They're attuned to it. It's just they kill it at the end.
Yeah.
And they say you can't get that from anything else. You know, it's a great connection with nature in that sense. Okay, well, actually, yes, because birdwatchers do exactly that. We just don't harm. In most cases, we never harm the bird. We never harm the subject of our prey at the end.
I think that's why I tend to have a bit more respect for, say, bow hunters versus just people with rifles. I mean, I'm sure there are good and bad people in both groups, but it seems like from the amount that I know from bow hunters, they seem to have to be very selective. They have to make sure that their shot will definitely kill, or they won't take it because they don't want to wound the animal. And they'll spend 3 or 4 days trying to find something like a deer. You know, usually they're hunting invasive animals as well, which is, I guess, a different argument. Anyway, switching back onto the main sort of topic, what is Birdlife Australia and what's its role?
Yes, well, Birdlife Australia has been around in one form or another for 120 years now, and it's our national bird conservation organisation. Sort of had its history in organisations that were originally sort of ornithological societies and then social birdwatching groups. But I think everyone that has a passion for birds comes to a realisation that, you know, the birds that you love, the things that bring you most joy in your life, are in trouble, and we want to continue to have them in our lives, so we need to do something about it. So Birdlife Australia was formed from a merger of these groups in 2012 to focus primarily on conservation of Australia's native birds. And I was a member of the previous organisations for many years and then volunteered for them. And I've only worked for them for the last 10 years when I came on board as the editor of Australian Birdlife magazine.
That's how my dad will know you too, because he has hundreds of those around the house.
Yeah. So we took the previous magazines of the different organisations, created a new one, Australian Birdlife, and I've just only this year handed over the reins of that to my former production editor, Cara Schultz, who I created the magazine with, and she's taken on that. And I'm focusing now as the public affairs manager, basically being the spokesperson for the organisation and for birds in general in the media, and trying to get that interest and translate that interest that I know people have and into people supporting the work that we do and supporting birds in general, supporting their survival. So Birdlife Australia is a volunteer supported organisation, and although it has probably 60 or 70 staff these days across the country working on specific bird conservation projects, most of our work is supported by volunteers. the monitoring they do, or the protection of nesting sites, those sorts of things. And so we work, our aim is to work with our volunteers and with other organisations and other communities to prevent extinctions of Australian birds and try and turn around their fate, because the monitoring work that we've been able to do, especially over the last 30 years, is actually able to quantify how poorly so many of our birds are doing and how their populations are in sharp decline right across the country, all sorts of different habitats, all sorts of different regions. And if there's, nobody's in there advocating specifically for birds, so we jump in doing that. And we know if you can protect the sort of flagship bird species, often that has a cascading or an umbrella effect in protecting entire habitats and the bird and the other animals and plants that rely on those habitats that support the birds. So that's what BirdLife does. We do conservation and also trying to raise and celebrate the awareness of Australia's birds, because we know that there might be only a few thousand hardcore bird watchers in Australia, but we know from all the work we've done and from all the media response that I've got, there is literally millions of people in Australia who have a love for birds. We know from, in terms of birds in your backyard, we've run a Birds in Backyards program for 20 years, and people don't think of themselves as bird watchers who are involved in that. And we know from research out of Griffith Uni that between 30 to 50% of Australian people feed birds in their backyards. So
I'm guilty.
Yeah, same. Same.
It is funny because it's for me and the listeners, the viewers of this podcast. The amount of people I see who even just haven't even come to Australia that still have an awareness and passion for birds like kookaburras, cockatoos, magpies, seagulls. They know of lorikeets. They know of all these birds and seem to already love them before they even necessarily step foot on our continent. And then when they get here, any of the Instagram feeds or Facebook pages that I go to that's about, say Brazilians in Melbourne or whatever, loads of people are always so excited to see these birds and interact with them. So it is such a unique thing. I'm biased because I obviously live in Australia and the job that I have, but I don't know what it's like I haven't seen that same sort of thing for, say, like France or for Great Britain, where people are like, man, I can't wait to go there to see the parrots, so it is really important that we do as much as we can for their conservation. A lot of the listeners are probably interested in volunteering for you and the organisation BirdLife Australia, because obviously they can practice their English at the same time as be able to interact with Australian wildlife and do some good. How can they find out more about that and volunteer for you guys?
Yeah, there are opportunities to volunteer with us, and we often have visiting researchers from other countries coming and working with our people as well in sort of secondments and other things like that. But yeah, I suppose the easiest way would be to go to the BirdLife website and birdlife.org.au, and there are volunteer opportunities there. At the moment, of course, it's really difficult in terms of being able to volunteer out and going out in the field.
You've got to be 5 kilometres within the field research location.
We've had to really put the brakes on a lot of our volunteer participation this year, which has been a real tragedy because we were relying on volunteers to get out and do a lot of post-bushfire surveys.
Yeah.
Thanks to the monitoring programs that BirdLife Australia has had in place for decades, we actually have a fairly good idea of what birds occurred in the areas that have been devastated by bushfires, what occurred there before, and we really want to get a good handle on what survived and where things are coming back so that we can focus future protection, fire protection from future fires and things like that on those refuge areas.
So do we have any strong idea of how the 2019-2020 bushfires over summer have affected the bird life in Australia? Because I can imagine, I think I kept seeing numbers of between 1 and 3 billion animals have been incinerated, not including insects and other invertebrates. I assume a large portion of those were birds.
Yeah, I think there was a recent update to those figures. I think when they're saying 3 billion vertebrate animals, and I think, and I'm probably not correct here, but it was something like at least 180 million birds
Jesus.
estimated to have perished in the fires, and that's an underestimate, I would suspect. But apart from the tragedy of those individual numbers, or the frighteningly high individual numbers, is a whole heap of birds. There are birds that were already threatened that have been impacted by bushfires, like the western ground parrot, which had already had 90% of its habitat burnt, remaining habitat burnt in the last 5 years. And then there was another bushfire there that really didn't get much attention because it was in a remote area in Western Australia. And that then burnt, a certain percentage of the remaining 10% of habitat available. So those threatened birds became more endangered, right on the precipice of extinction because of these fires. But the really frightening thing is that we had birds that were of no concern to us in a conservation sense, birds that had a very broad distribution, extensive distribution, and in good numbers, especially in Eastern Australia and on Kangaroo Island. Their numbers are just absolutely hammered, and we potentially are going to see dozens of previously secure species now in species lists because their habitat's been burnt. And a lot of these birds are adapted to fire, and they would, in a normal bushfire, they would survive. But because these fires were so intense, so vast, that the little refuge pockets of unburned areas just aren't there as they would be in the past. And you'd have areas adjacent to the burned areas that the birds could repopulate. And what we need volunteers to work out is to see where any birds have survived and how they're repopulating, because it may be that even common birds in the forest, like lyrebirds, those iconic lyrebirds, 40% of habitat of lyrebirds was burnt. And we know lyrebirds are quite good individually at surviving fires, but whether they have food in the landscape or whether they're more vulnerable to predators afterwards because they don't have anywhere to hide from foxes and cats.
And they're probably competing with one another too, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's so little food around. That's why people have been reporting so many interesting birds in their backyards and that's something we're looking forward to in this year's Aussie Backyard Bird Count, to see, 6, 8, 10 months after the fires, are there still bushfire refugees clinging on in suburban gardens, in the towns? Often in the bushfire areas, the only places that get saved are the houses, the adjacent garden. And so that's the only patch of greenery. But even in areas that are quite distant from the bushfire zone, hundreds of kilometres away, you can see bushfire refugees flying in. We've had that in Melbourne this year for the first time in probably 150 years. We've had a bird called the glossy black cockatoo turn up in the suburbs of Melbourne.
I mentioned this on the podcast with Dad, and that's crazy, right? After so long, but he was like, I don't know if it actually is that the population's expanded or anything, or if this thing is just moving away from where its habitat's been destroyed. Yes,
they're already. There was a subspecies on Kangaroo Island that had been a really great conservation success story. It had been, in the 1990s, a recovery plan was put in place and funded by the federal government, the South Australian government. And over the next decades, the population tripled, the community were involved. It was really great, but the funding had run out, the plan had lapsed, and there was no work being done on them. It was only really the community that was keeping that going. But now sort of something like 70 or 80% of their habitat got burnt on the Kangaroo Island. So there is funding for that bird now. But the next population in Victoria, it was over in Mallacoota in East Gippsland. That's the only spot you really got it in Victoria. And those birds were their habitat was totally wiped out. And we saw birds immediately afterwards in the town of Mallacoota, where they normally wouldn't go. They only eat one type of tree. They eat she oaks, the casuarina.
Yeah.
And they've ended up in Melbourne, and it has to be because they're displaced by the fires.
And they're just looking for those plants.
Yeah, and which we do have around Melbourne, even in the suburbs. So there's been sightings of at least a group of 3 and possibly other birds as well. And whether they can survive here or whether they can eke out a living for long enough before they get back to where they should be. We just don't know.
So finishing up, can you tell us about the Aussie Backyard Bird Count this year, when it starts, what it is, and how people can get involved and help you guys out?
Yeah, we started the Aussie Backyard Bird Count at Birdlife Australia back in 2014 because we realised, as I said earlier, we realised there was a large group of people in Australia who love their birds but would never consider themselves to be bird watchers or bird nerds. They just appreciate and love having birds in their life around their backyard. And we also realised we don't have much information about some of our most common birds. By our nature, Birdlife Australia focuses on threatened species. So we work on birds like glossy black cockatoos or regent honeyeaters, these birds that are on the path to extinction. So we actually know more about the birds that are going extinct because we put the study in.
Yeah.
But the common birds, the birds we see every day, we kind of take for granted. And as you said earlier, Australia's common birds are spectacular. The most common bird that we've seen, most frequently seen bird, the biggest numbers right across Australia in all of the Aussie Backyard Bird Counts has been the rainbow lorikeet. It's just a stunning bird. It's psychedelic in its colours, and it's gregarious and cheeky and loud, and it's in every capital city in the country. And we really didn't know how those birds were going or what they were doing. So this is after 6 years of the bird count. This will be the 7th. We're starting to get this great snapshot every year.
Yeah.
Every October in the traditional bird week, in spring in Australia, people download the app or they can enter online.
How can they find the app and the online website?
Yeah, the app is the Aussie Bird Count app.
Yep.
You download that, and even though it's not currently active until October, it has a field guide component to it. So people who love their birds but don't know what they're looking at, they can use the app and they can basically key in the features of the bird they see, the size, the shape, and the colours, and the app will throw up some potential birds in your area that you might be seeing to help you on your way. And so those people entering all that data, they take 20 minutes in the week. They can do it in their backyard, their front yard, down the local park, anywhere that they go seeing birds in their day-to-day lives. And you can do as many counts as you want for the week. And that information is just every year becomes more and more valuable because especially if people do it in the same areas year after year, we get a sense of the trend of what's happening.
Yeah, that good replication.
Exactly. And last year we had 88,000 people involved.
Wow.
We counted, I should know this, but we counted something like 2.5 million birds.
Holy moly.
And I've got it here.
You wonder if any of them were seen twice.
Yeah. I know we actually counted 3.3 million birds.
Wow.
And that's in people's backyards, the places where people live. So that amount of big data is starting to really pay off for us and to see what's happening with birds. And it's amazing what you do see when even me, I look at birds every day. I can't help it. But when I do my backyard bird count, you get this window into the world that's going on outside your doorstep. And you get a sense of, even that in that 20 minutes, you get a sense of the rhythm of nature. Different birds will come in and they'll drive other birds out, and then something else will fly in and everything else will attack that bird. And
bloody wattlebirds and the New Holland honeyeaters.
The noisy miners, yeah. It's like a soap opera every hour of every day outside your window. So we've got people who've done it. Once they get involved, they just absolutely love that aspect of it. And
it is insane, right? Because it's something I noticed only when I started doing bird photography. Once you start paying attention to the animals and seeing them in repeated times, once you go to that location, you're like, holy crap, that's the same bird that I saw yesterday on the same tree. in the same branch, it's just in the same nest. So, and they'll move. You sometimes, especially if it's something that's a little less common, that there may only be one of them at a certain location, you get used to, okay, so he goes to that tree, then he sits on that rock, and then he goes up into that, mountain over there, and then he comes back around and he just does that loop all day long. And you're like, you don't realize how often that, like, if I were to walk outside, I would see things like magpies, lorikeets, and wattlebirds and newhorn honeyeaters. They're actually going to be the birds that I see almost on a daily basis, because you just think, oh, birds move around and it's never the same bird, because you can't really tell one from another. But when you start, getting into that sort of meditative kind of experience of paying attention to them and watching them, you start recognizing them as like neighbors, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. You just, so I've lost my train of thought there. That's especially we've noticed this year is because so many people in Australia, especially in our cities, have been in lockdown, and in Melbourne, where we liked it so much, we decided to do it all over again. In our second lockdown, people were coming to us at Birdlife and coming to me when I was doing radio appearances and going, what the hell is going on with the birds? Is COVID affecting them? They're going crazy. And it's like, I'd listen to their descriptions and go, no, that's what birds do. Australian birds are incredible characters. They're loud and garrulous, and they're real. The sort of original Aussie larrikin are parrots and other birds. And people are noticing them for the first time because we are quiet for once. We're not rushing around. There's no traffic. We're at home. We're desperately seeking news from outside. And the birds bring it to us, and people are noticing them for the first time. And this is what we've seen with people doing the backyard bird count. They get attuned to what's going on in their neighbourhood. And this year's going to be really interesting because so many people are used to the birds in their backyards, and we hopefully are going to get a really good response, because the more feedback that we get about how people are appreciating their birds is great, but the information they give us can really help us work out, okay, affected by COVID. Are birds moving back into the cities this year? We'll be able to tell that because of the reporting rates that we get from last year compared to this year, that sort of thing.
Are there any big, since you started in 2014, are there any big sort of implications of the data that you've collected so far for things like research and conservation? Have you noticed any big changes yet already, or is it early days?
It's still, in terms of our last year was the first time we had a new bird enter the top 10 across Australia. It was interestingly the controversial ibis, the bin chicken, the Australian white ibis, and there were a couple of other birds that became many more were counted last year, and 2018 as well. The numbers kept going up, and it really shows that it was because of the drought.
Yeah,
and all these birds, either from the inland or from sort of areas that were attracted into the urban wetlands, they'd lost their habitat in the Murray-Darling or just out anywhere across Australia. And of course, the one place we keep putting water into during a drought are urban areas.
Yeah.
So it just shows that we think of nature being outside of us. Like when people ask me about where do you go bird watching, they say down up at Kakadu or something. And you can bird watch everywhere. And it just shows the results we got from last year, the increase in birds like ibis, and also dry country birds like crested pigeons and little corellas that are coming into our cities during drought and staying there. That was really, that's what's showing up in the data. And it's going to be interesting this year because we've got the bushfires, but we've also, in a lot of areas, we've had a decent rain since most of this year. So it's going to be fascinating to see what bush birds have come into the urban area because of bushfires, and also what dry country birds have gone back because there's a lot more water in the landscape.
So to get involved, go download the app Aussie Backyard Bird Count and go to the website as well. And it takes place for just 1 week, right? Between the 19th and 25th of October.
Yes. The app, the Aussie Bird Count app, becomes live from the 1st of October, and so we keep it open for that month. And people tend not to be able to resist sneaking in a few early surveys, but our science people have worked out how to factor all of that in.
Yeah.
And it's runs for a week, as you said, and in October, where we try and get everyone to do at least one bird count in their backyard or their local park or wherever they spend their part of their day in their daily life.
Yeah, so definitely do it, guys, especially obviously if you're in Australia. It probably won't help too much if you're in Siberia or China or something, but if you're in Australia, do that in October, just 20 minutes for once a day or once a week?
You can do it at least once. We get people doing it every day.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what people can see, even in the most densely built up inner city areas. You can still see, from your high-rise tower balcony, you can still, in 20 minutes, easily see 10 different birds flying past. Australia is incredibly fortunate that we still have enough amazing, interesting birds around that are still reasonably common, that you can have a rewarding experience despite being in the middle of the most built-up parts of the country.
Do you mind me asking, does it skew those somewhat towards birds that are easily recognisable and away from birds that are harder to recognise or rarer, that people might just be like, I've no idea?
I think that takes care of itself in the sense that most birds that people see in urban areas are fairly recognisable. We do have a pretty thorough vetting process, and we don't include this data with our regular monitoring survey data. We do quarantine it so that so that we can analyse it specifically, but also make sure we realise that people aren't experts doing this. And so one of the things we're hoping to do research on is to see whether the obvious errors are reducing over the years, whether the whole campaign is showing that we're educating people about what birds they actually see. So, but the thing is, the birds that survive in the cities are usually the bold ones,
Yep.
and often they're the most easily recognisable. So the tricky bird ID that the bird nerds love and drive everyone else crazy, that can still happen, but it's generally you have to go into the bush for those sorts of things to
An
work.
issue.
Yeah.
Are you in a rush, or do you mind if I ask you one last question?
No, that's all right. That's fine.
So I was reading some articles recently about kookaburras, obviously having been introduced into Perth and I think making it to Esperance, as well as being introduced into Tasmania and slowly making it southwest, I think, as a result of climate change.
Yes.
How do you feel about sort of internal introductions of species within Australia as someone who is passionate about birds?
It creates really interesting dilemmas, because you can argue that a bird like a kookaburra is as natural to Tasmania as a peacock or a bald eagle. They just didn't evolve there, and the ecology of places like Tasmania and Southwest Australia aren't geared to having that species there. And as kookaburras are a top predator, they have ravaged the reptile populations of areas, and they're well, as brilliant and iconic and lovely birds as they are quite the notorious nest robber.
Mm-hmm.
They will prey on the young in the nest of other small birds. So they can do a lot of ecological damage. So it's a really interesting question, and it happens with a lot of species that, whether they've been deliberately introduced into an area or through the way we've changed our landscape in Australia, through clearing, through providing water in dry areas, through climate change, we are getting birds that are turning up in areas where they would not normally have occurred. So what do you do when those birds start to build up in numbers and displace the birds that have been there originally? This is happening with, for instance, birds like corellas, which some people quite a pest. They're amazing birds. They're hilarious and intelligent and long-lived and loyal and incredibly social birds, but they're occurring now in parts of Australia where they have never occurred previously. And we're seeing, the BirdLife data shows, we're seeing a decline generally in hollow nesting birds, like things like rosellas and yellow-tailed black cockatoos. And one of the factors could be that birds like galahs and corellas have moved in and are taking over their nesting areas. So it's a naturally occurring species, but it's moving because of unnatural forces. So how do you reconcile that? It's really interesting. And the interesting thing with the kookaburra is through BirdLife Australia's monitoring, we have discovered, it was quite a shock really, that in eastern Australia, kookaburras are actually on the decline.
Oh, really?
They still seem really common, but from our work that we published in 2015 in the State of Australia's Birds, out of tens of thousands of surveys over 15 years from the turn of the century, the number of reports of kookaburras had declined in areas around, like in eastern Australia between Sydney and Brisbane. They declined by 40%.
Do we have any idea why that's the case?
Well, this is the big. We don't know for sure. It could be a number of factors. It could, and that 15-year period included the millennium drought and the wetter years. So it wasn't exactly drought, but it could have been a decline in productivity in the landscape. It could have been a loss of, insect life that feeds the food chain. Sort
of cascading effect, because I was reading something about them actually doing quite well in suburban areas as a result of the sort of thick brush or, vegetation kind of being spread out so that they can just sit in trees and watch for little lizards and other things to move around. So,
well, that's one thing that the Aussie Backyard Bird Count has helped us with, is we thought perhaps the decline in eastern Australia, even though they're booming in Western Australia and Tasmania, the decline in eastern Australia might have been masked by the fact that they were moving out of the bush and country areas into suburban and peri-urban areas. However, we specifically looked at this over the first few years of the Aussie Backyard Bird Count, and it seems that even in the suburban areas, the outer suburbs, especially, the numbers of kookaburras, or the reporting rates of kookaburras, that is how many times people report seeing them, has actually started to decline over the first 5 or 6 years of the Aussie bird count. So even as a backyard bird, we thought maybe they were coming in, but it turns out they're actually diminishing in number in urban areas as well. So it is a fascinating thing.
So it shows, though, why the Aussie Backyard Bird Count is so important, because you kind of get early warning signs for these kinds of things before the population collapses, and then all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, we should probably do something.
Yes. I think we tend to have there's a tendency in conservation that the public only start to care about an animal when it gets down to so few individuals that we can almost name them.
Yeah.
And a bird like a kookaburra, and another reason the kookaburra may be and may be on the decline, and also magpies in some areas too, is potentially this secondary poisoning from the new generation of rat bait that people are putting out.
Really?
It's building up, and it's more effective than the first generation, but the rats don't die at the feeding station. And so the birds like kookaburras, but particularly owls, things like boobook owls and other birds of prey, are either finding dead rats and mice and eating them, or finding them affected by the poison but haven't died. And so they're ingesting the poison, and this new generation of poisons aren't breaking down like they used to, like the old generation. So the toxic levels are building up in our birds of prey. And we don't know this. We definitely know it's happening for owls, things like boobook owls and other birds of prey, but it may also be a factor in the decline of kookaburras and also magpies. We don't know that for sure, but we would never know to investigate that if we didn't have this data that we've collected from stuff like the Aussie bird count.
So I've always wondered, when driving along country roads or even highways, you see a lot of dead birds on the side of the road. Is that somewhere that scientists should be trying to collect those animals that have obviously been hit by cars to try and then work out, okay, had these ingested any of these, like measure the levels of this toxin to work out if it is a big problem and it's widespread, so that they can change policy or implement some kind of restriction on that kind of toxin or poison?
Well, that's exactly what happened in Western Australia. There was a researcher, Mike Law, who did exactly that. He drove the roads in the southwest of Western Australia from Perth through to Albany, and he collected every dead owl that he found by the side of the road. Now, one of the impacts of this poisoning is that it cognitively impairs the birds, so they might come to the edge of the road and they're just not as quick and nimble as getting out of the way of the cars, so they get hit more often. So he wanted to find out what was killing these birds. He'd noticed them, and he found really staggering result that 73% of all the road-killed owls that he studied, 73% had this second-generation rat poison in them.
Really? Even in those areas, which is somewhat rural, right, between South Australia and Perth along the Nullarbor plains?
No, just in the southwest of WA from Melbourne.
Oh, okay. Sorry, got you.
But, yeah, so it was rural, it was suburban fringe, it was forest country, it was open grassland, wheat belt sort of country. And, yeah, 73% had the poison in their system, and I think it was 18% had the poison at lethal levels.
Wow. So they were dying of it at the time that they were hit by cars.
Yeah. So we know from that study that's a huge problem, and we've found that in individual birds that we've had autopsied as well, but randomly. But yes, it is a field, very gruesome field, where you could study what's happening to the birds in the landscape.
The last sort of question I had for you that I had just come to mind was when you were mentioning the Aussie bin chicken, the I don't think, not straw-necked ibis, right? Just the white ibis or the...
Yeah, the white ibis.
The white ibis, that's the bin chicken. Why are they only really bin chickens in Sydney and Brisbane? Because I've never seen them... I believe they're the same species down in Victoria here as the ones that are in Sydney and Brisbane, but they don't seem to have that same behaviour of raiding bins.
Yes.
So they seem to be much cleaner down here.
Well, this is a fantastic story, actually, and it shows how birds, we always think of them as almost like automatons that just act on instinct. But this shows that even a bird like the ibis, that people regard as quite primitive, has a culture and can learn behaviours. Where we think the bin feeding came from was actually, it originated in Victoria, but in one place at Healesville Zoo in east of Melbourne. In the 1950s and 60s, they had ibis wandering the ground. They're still there, but they would clip the wings, and they were considered quite exotic, and so it was part of the zoo experience. And those birds came to know that they could get food out of rubbish bins, they could get food off barbecue plates, off people's picnicking thing, and they still do that at Healesville. The birds are the descendants of the birds originally released there, and even though they're free flying around Healesville, they stay at Healesville. In the 1970s, Taronga Zoo in Sydney and also Currumbin Bird Sanctuary in the Gold Coast, they took birds from Healesville, they exchanged them, and they had them in their grounds. Those actually grew out, like their wings were clipped, the wings grew out and they flew off, and wild birds were attracted in during drought years and things like that, and they mingled with wild birds and created these new populations that started breeding around those areas, and they inherited or they continued those foraging behaviours, getting food from human sources. So as more birds came in from the Murray-Darling seeking drought refuge, they mingled and they learnt that as well. So you get these populations of what we call the bin chicken now, centred mainly in Sydney and also the Gold Coast, and I think they've got that behaviour now in Brisbane. But essentially, it's become like a cultural behaviour of those populations of ibis.
That's astonishing, right? That's astonishing, because it's kind of like it's something that humans have imparted, this cultural foraging behavior on these animals. They've moved around the country, and it may end up being something that's like a positive selection pressure for them, where now they're going to know, when there's drought and everything, or when there's, scarcity of food, that they can just go and raid bins, and the species may survive better in human interaction than it would have otherwise. Because the ones down here, you only see them at the beach or in Swan Bay or in farms and stuff. They don't tend to be raiding bins and everything. So I was always like, what the hell? It's just a bizarre story.
And interestingly, there's also studies showing that they've done blood samples and things of the ibis and their chicks and also their eggs in Sydney, and it turns out, on the one hand, they're sort of sacrificing an abundance of food, or they're sacrificing living in the cities, and they get an abundance of food, but the actual health of the birds is not, they're not as in good condition as birds in a natural state. So it's an interesting trade-off that they're doing. They're basically, the junk food is affecting them, but I think it means that they have a higher nesting success in the city, but the long-term health of the chicks is not as good.
That's amazing. Anyway, Sean Dooley, I've kept you for long enough. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Can you just remind listeners where they can go and find out more about Birdlife Australia and the Backyard Bird Count, and you and your book? Yeah,
certainly. Birdlife Australia, you can just Google us, but birdlife.org.au. The Aussie Backyard Bird Count, you can download the app at Aussie. It's the Aussie Bird Count app, or if you want to check out the website, it's aussiebirdcount.org.au. And for me, if you're interested in the big twitch, it's available online from Allen and Unwin, the publisher, and probably I think it's still on Amazon. So those sorts of places you can check it out.
Well, and we didn't get into the fact that you are really funny. I mean, I don't mean that as a slight. You were in this interview, but reading the writing in this book, it is very humorous. And we didn't get into the fact that you did actually write for the comedy show Spicks and Specks, among others, I assume. It reads very similar to me as Gert by David Hunt and True Gert. Have you read those two?
Right. No, I know them, but I haven't read them, no.
Suss them out, because, it's one of those things where I was thinking you guys are either going to hate each other or really enjoy each other's work, but I felt that same kind of Aussie sense of humour. So Gert's obviously a history take on Australian history, but David's tried to make it much more palatable to the average person, as opposed to, historians wearing their dusty coats and everything like that. Anyway, Sean, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm looking forward to hopefully chatting with you again in the future.
No worries. Thanks very much, Peter. It was great.
Awesome work, mate. I'll just hit pause on the recording here. Once again, thank you so much. I know that